Now we want to make a distinction between two different kinds of testing, black box and white box. So remember that a specification is a description of the function's behavior. So it's what the types of the parameter are, the return value type, and the constraints and relationships between those. Black box testing means that you're choosing these test cases only by looking at the specification. And that's what we've been doing in the examples so far. So we partitioned and we looked for boundary cases in the multiply function and the max function, looking only at the method signatures and documentation comments of those functions, not looking at the actual method body that implemented them. In contrast, white box testing, which is also called glass box, means that you are actually using knowledge of how the function is implemented to choose your test cases. So, for example, if an implementation is tricky and it's selecting which algorithm it's going to use to implement the method depending on features of the input, then you should make sure that you have a test case that triggers each one of those algorithms. Similarly, if there's an internal cache inside the implementation that remembers answers to previous inputs, then you should make sure that you try the same input again in your test cases. Both of these things would not be visible normally in the specification. They can only be seen, or you can only think of using them as partitions if you look at the implementation. Now, when you're doing white box testing, you have to still be careful that your test cases don't require specific implementation behavior that isn't actually called for by the spec. So, for example, if the spec just says throw an exception if the input is poorly formatted, then your test shouldn't check specifically that it's a null pointer exception just because that's what the current method body does. The spec is much more general in this case. It just says any old exception. So your test case needs to likewise be general in order to preserve the implementer's freedom. We'll have a lot more to say about this in the class on specs, but the basic idea is that tests should always respect the specification.